place for people. People that need help, and that's all of us at one time or another. We need different kinds of help maybe. GODTEL is not primarily a place to give people a roof over their head and food to eat. GODTEL is a place whereby we can tell people about Jesus Christ. GODTEL is a school. It's my school. It's my wife's school. It's a place whereby we can learn how to minister to people, how to love people, sometimes people that are unlovable. And all the people that cooperate in this effort get to be part of what's going on at GODTEL.
I'm having a really hard time. Doctor, after my heart attack, the doctor said that I needed to walk 30 minutes a day because other than this arteries being plugged up, my body's in great shape. My heart's real young. I don't know how they figure that, but anyway. Says, you got the heart of an 18-year-old, so get out there and get with it. So Nancy and I have been walking 30 minutes as fast as we can. Well, as fast as she can. I have to kind of slow down for her. Otherwise, I'd be leaving her in the dust. And she doesn't like dust. Well, tonight's message is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And it's basically a three-part series, but it's Celibacy and Marriage. We're going to look at part of it tonight. Now, one of the things that most preachers don't ever want to talk about is sex. I haven't figured out why, because the Bible talks about it an awful lot. And the reason God talks about it so much is because He wants you to understand what your responsibilities are and what He expects out of you in a marriage. The problem is we have a lot of people who don't want to talk about it, but they're all doing it. And that's a real problem. I remember when I was growing up, I had to learn all about sex from my buddies, out in the back. And they didn't know any more than I did, but my dad never taught me anything about it. My mother, I don't remember before she left, she never taught the girls anything. Nobody wanted to talk about it. But it's really quite natural. But there are do's and don'ts that go with it. And if you do what God says, you will be blessed. If you don't, you're going to suffer. And a lot of you have already been through that, and so you've been through relationships that didn't work, and we're all messed up because you didn't do it the way God said. Now, concerning the things whereof, this is starting in verse 1, whereof you wrote unto me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife has not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband has not power over his body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and then come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your say it, dear. Incontinency. I'll tell you what it means in a minute. I don't know why I can't say that word right, but it's one of those words. It's kind of like aluminum. I can say aluminum. I don't need your help. But I speak this by permission and not by commandment. For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner and one after another. I say therefore unto the unmarried and widows, it is good for them to abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn. I'll be glad when we get to that verse again, because hardly anybody knows what that means. And it's so simple. But I've heard preachers preach on that thing, and they say it's about going to hell. It has nothing to do with hell. We'll get there in just a second. Now, concerning the things I wrote you, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. And what he's talking to is he's speaking to Christians here, and he's talking about it's better if you don't have anything to do with a woman, if you're not married especially. It's kind of like eating a Snickers bar. If you've never had one, you don't know what you're missing. That's simple, isn't it? And this is what he's talking about. If you've never had any kind of relationship with a woman, then you don't know what you're missing. And that's good, especially if you're not married. And the purpose of that is so they could do the work of God. It's really hard for a person to do the work of God if they're married. It's not impossible, but it's harder because you're thinking always, you got this concern about your wife, what her needs are. And so your loyalties are somewhat divided between God and your wife. Of course, I know some people that have taken it too far. I met a man one day and we were talking to him about his relationship to God, and he says, I don't have to do what God says, I have to do what my wife says. I said, boy, I'd hate to live in that house. There was a time when things were different. Until World War II, things were different. For thousands of years, women were homemakers. They took care of the house. And folks, don't get me wrong, I'm not against a woman having a career. What I'm against is a woman trying to have a career and trying to have a home at the same time. It can't be done. And that's why most women that have careers end up divorced. And they end up tearing up a family. And there's other people taking care of their children, and the children don't even know who they are. So when they're 15, 16 years old, I hate you kind of stuff goes on. I lived through a lot of that. For some reason today, and it started in World War II when women started going to work. And I'll give you a good example. My home. My dad was a factory worker. One of the jobs he had I really enjoyed. He worked at Hoffman Candy Company in Los Angeles, and every Friday they let him bring a box of candy home. And of course, guess who got to eat it? Us kids, And I said, Dad, go back to work and bring us some more candy. And he'd bring us Hershey bars and all that kind of stuff, and they'd give him a certain amount of candy every week. And he worked hard. He was very faithful to do his work and support his family. We lived on 95th Street, which is about 2 blocks out of Watts, and we rented a house, but it was a nice house. We had a car. We had all the stuff, regular middle-class family. Well, then they decided to move out to Whittier, which is 16 miles away, and buy a house, which in those days, in the 50s, that house, which today sells for $500,000, sold for about $9,000. And I know that because I have relatives out there that have sold some homes. My sister just sold one for almost $500,000 that she paid about $9,000 for. The prices really went up. Land prices skyrocketed out there. They sell land by the inch. It's amazing. And so my dad and mom decided they wanted this house. And my mom decided, and my dad decided, that if my mom would go to work, then they would have a little extra money. Maybe could buy a second car, and do some things they wanted to do. And so my mom got a job at Bank of America as a key punch operator. I know a lot of you don't have any concept of what that is, but back in the old days when computers were just starting out, they had cards that had little holes in them. And those holes told the machine everything that needed to spit out information for you for your bank accounts. And that's what she did. She operated the key punch thing. It was kind of like a typewriter. It punched holes in those cards, though. And everything was rocking along fine for a little while, but then after a while, she was having an affair with one of the vice presidents. Then she left my dad and us kids and went off with Bill, the vice president. And in the course of time, of course, had 2 more kids and pretty much disowned us. Didn't want to have anything to do with us, really. And she ended up dying at age 42 with cancer. Her husband, who adored her, he died just 2 years later after gambling away everything they owned, including their house. They lived up in Lake Tahoe, where gambling's legalized on the Nevada side of the border. And then one of her kids died about 2 weeks after that. It was a real mess. She did what she thought she needed to do to climb her little ladder of success. Only the whole thing fell apart, and I have no doubt that was God bringing it all down. They should have been happy and content with what my dad, everything was fine. But once my mother went to work, us kids pretty much raised ourselves. After she left, I was 9 years old when she left, I did raise myself because my dad was destroyed. He worshiped my mother, and so he just fell apart, you know. He went to work, he kept a roof over our heads, but we kept going downhill, you know. And it got worse and worse and worse until finally I left home when I was 16. And things were pretty bad. I was in and out of jail all the time. First time I got arrested, I was 10 years old for shoplifting. When I was 13, I got arrested for burglary. And it was just one thing after that, after another, until finally I was facing the rest of my life in prison. I had so many counts, it was just unbelievable. And God worked that out. And that's why 40-something years ago, I ended up in Texas, God's country. Except if they tell you it's the Bible Belt, you better watch out. The pants are liable to fall down because somebody forgot to buckle the belt. So it's good for a man. This is what he's saying. If you're not married, it's better not to touch a woman. Don't even get yourself into that. Now, folks, I want to tell you something. In some countries today, they still practice the same thing they practiced thousands of years ago, where the marriages are arranged when the kids are little babies. And they don't really even see each other until their wedding day. And those marriages last. They learn to love one another like you're supposed to. There's this thing about falling in love, that's a big joke. I mean, people come to me, I fell in love. And then they fall out of love 6 months later, you know. And we've got this dating thing. And we've got 50% of our population ends up in divorce. I forget what the exact numbers are, but unwed mothers, that's an unbelievable amount. Something like 50%. In the church, out of the church, doesn't make any difference. The dating thing doesn't work. It never has. What it does is it gives people, young people especially, a chance to get in trouble. I know, firsthand experience. So he says, nevertheless, to avoid fornication. Now this is illicit sex outside of marriage. Let every man have his own wife and every woman have her own husband. Now he's talking about the fact that they were betrothed when they were young. And those betrothals were basically the same thing as a marriage. They just didn't consummate it until the wedding ceremony when they were young adults. Usually in this culture, 14 years old, 15 years old, they would get married. But they were different than we are, because you see, these kids were taught by their parents what was expected out of them, what they were supposed to do, their responsibilities in that marriage. They didn't face marriage lightly. It was a responsibility thing. They were going to make this thing work, and they did. They also learned that love is something you learn. My wife and I got married 45 years ago, but I don't know that we really started loving each other until the second year or so. And we started loving like God says to do in His Word. You know, God commands the men to love their wives like Christ loved the church in Ephesians chapter 5. It doesn't say anything in the Bible about feelings. It doesn't say anything about feeling like it. It says do it. Love your wives. Wives, submit to your own husband. It doesn't say feel like it. It says do it. But most people in America don't want to do it. They'd rather wait for some magical feeling to strike them. I was counseling with a couple, and they said, we're in love. And I asked the guy, I said, how do you know you're in love? And he says, I got this feeling, preacher. I said, how do you know that wasn't the pickle you had last night? How do you know where the feeling comes from? And most people with these feelings, it's not really a feeling of love, it's lust. They like this person because they look good. They sound good. We're dealing with people who have been on the internet. Worst thing in the world you can do is try to find love on the internet. And this guy's been sending money to this woman over in Germany that says she loves him and all this kind of stuff. And it's fallen apart because he lost his job and he can't send her any more money. That's a good thing. But he's crushed. He's in love, you know. Folks, this stuff about love is crazy. It doesn't work. Can't you think, can't you look back in your life and figure this out? It doesn't work. If it worked, those of you that have been in relationships would still be in them. But you're not. My first wife ran off with my best friend. Oh, we were in love until she wanted to love my best friend. Well, I've been looking for that dude. Maybe he'll turn in on the YouTube, Josh, and see this. His name's Robert. Robert, thank you! One of the best things that ever happened to me outside of getting saved. So to avoid illicit sexual relationships, he says, then go ahead and consummate your marriage. Go ahead and do that. Now, back in those days, and we talked about this last week, but in Exodus chapter 21, verse 10, God gives rules for multiple wives. And also in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 21, verse 15. It was a different culture. Our culture, we have laws, and the laws say you can only have one wife. Pretty good law as far as I'm concerned, because I can only afford one barely. But we are told in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the land. Well, one of these laws in this land is that you can only have one wife. I've had people come to me and say, I don't like that law. I say, well, then get it changed. They just kind of look at me. I look, if you don't like a law, don't break the law. Get the law changed. If you can get the law changed, then everything will be like you want it, you know. It's the same thing with all this business about illegal aliens. The operative word is illegal. It's against the law. The liberals can't seem to understand that. It's against the law. If they want to come to our country, they need to come here legally like my mother did when she came from Germany and became a citizen. But they haven't figured it out. Now, if you don't like the fact that we have this law, then what you need to do, instead of trying to break the law, which they're doing right now, is have the law changed. And say, we'll have open borders, just let anybody come in if that's what you want to do. But as long as the law says that there's a legal and an illegal way to get into this country, then we're supposed to obey the law. That's what Romans 13 is all about. Let the husband render to the wife due benevolence. Now, this is Old English, but what he's talking about here is sex. That's what he's talking about. The husband is supposed to meet the sexual needs of his wife. And the wife is supposed to meet the sexual needs of her husband. But we don't want to talk about that. It sounds dirty. It's not. Not in the marriage. Now, outside of marriage, it's wrong. It's immoral. And it's probably illegal, and it might even be fattening. I don't know. You don't own yourself. And you see, we got these women, and men too, but women mostly. I don't want to. I've got a headache. Well, there's no excuse in the Bible for a headache. I'm tired. Sorry, that's not an excuse. There's only one excuse given, and that is to separate so you can spend your time fasting and praying. But then he says in verse 5 there, but then come back together so Satan doesn't tempt you for your inconsistency. And that's what happens. I counsel with people and they said, we were having a hard time. I said, when was the last time you had sex? Oh, I think it was about 2 years ago. I said, well, there's part of your problem right there. Well, but I just don't feel like it. Well, where in the world did we come up with the idea that we don't have to render, as it says here, due benevolence, just because we don't feel like it? Now, a husband should have enough wisdom about him to see that his wife has needs, and if there's a problem, he should recognize it. And she should too. And sometimes my wife is sick sometimes. She doesn't feel good. I understand that. So I put another movie on. You know, because I'm supposed to love her like Christ loved the church and gave himself. There's times when I don't feel like it. Like when I had my heart attack 3 weeks ago, I did not feel like it. In fact, I didn't feel like living. But I did have a lot of fun, because I always have fun. I can have fun in an empty room having a heart attack by myself. I told my wife when she came to get me, I said, boy, it was really cool being in this hospital. She said, why? I said, because I had women falling all over me. I said, one came in and wanted blood. The other one came in and wanted to do an EKG. The other one came in and wanted to take my blood pressure. I said, well, this is cool, you know. I never had so many people paying me such attention. And had 2 doctors come to see me and talk to me about my condition, you know. That was pretty cool, too. And then I found out that I couldn't eat anything anymore that tasted good. That's not true. I just like to say that because it's funny. But I had to quit eating a lot of things that I really like. Pork chops. No more pork chops.
Bacon.
No steaks, no bacon. Oh, gosh. I didn't like bacon anyway.
Oh, come on.
I eat every day lately. I've been eating fish. No, you ever have a heart attack, you'll quit eating bacon too. It's got too much fat. So the wife is supposed to meet the needs of the husband is supposed to meet the needs of the wife. If you don't do that, you are defrauding, verse 5, defrauding one another. You're holding back that which is due the other person. And that's where the start of all of our troubles come from. Now, I speak this by permission and not of commandment. I says this for a good reason. It's because Paul was never married. So he says, I know this is true, but I'm saying this by permission, and he's saying this in order so these people won't look at him and say, well, what do you know about marriage? It's kind of like going for marriage counseling to a Catholic priest. What does a Catholic priest know about marriage? Nothing. How can he really counsel with you? Well, he can't. He can give you some words out of the Bible. If he would use the Bible, that would be good. And, give you some information that way. But he can never really understand. It's kind of like I didn't understand people with heart attacks until I had one. And when they described how it hurt and all that kind of stuff, I thought, why don't you just suck it up and be a man, you know? And then I had one, and I looked up, and there was this invisible man standing on my chest, beating me with a sledgehammer. That's what it felt like. All of a sudden, I had sympathy for other people. Oh, yeah. I have a friend right now that's got a problem with cancer in his lung. He doesn't smoke or anything, but he got cancer in his lung. So he hadn't smoked for 65 years. And because of the mass that's in his lung, it was building up this fluid, and he couldn't breathe, and he was having a hard time. Now, I can't really understand what he's going through. But I do have a lot more sympathy since I had this heart attack. It did make a difference. And this pain in my shoulder is about to drive me crazy. And they tell me it's going to be about a year. Now I can't even I was taking ibuprofen, which made my pain go away out of my shoulder. The doctor told me, don't do that. The ibuprofen and the blood thinners you're taking will make you bleed internally, and might bleed to death. Ooh. So now I got to put up with the pain. I said, take Tylenol. Well, I did. It doesn't do anything. So my arm just hurts. That's all right. I shouldn't have fallen off the car lift. That was my fault. Somebody asked me, he said, Brother June, how'd you fall off the car lift? I said, being stupid. And that's the truth. I was being stupid. Thinking I'm indestructible. And I was until I got past 70. Now I'm not indestructible anymore. So don't defraud one another. And remember that Satan will tempt you if you're not meeting the needs of each other. Folks, the common thing that's going to happen is that one or both parties start looking around for somebody else to do it. That's what happens. Man starts looking around, seeing what he can find, and he comes across knowing that the girls get prettier at closing time. He does. And the woman starts cheating. You know? That's what happens. I would that all men were even as myself. How was Paul? Well, he was unmarried. But you see, he had a gift from God. And he says this. He says, but every man has his own gift. One after this manner, one after another. We had a guy, I don't know if Martin and Mary remember him, but we had a guy, a young man worked for me called David. His name was David Bryan. And David was a college student, and he had a fiancée, and her name was Catherine or Kathy. And they were going to get married. Kathy was gorgeous. I mean, she was a beautiful, beautiful woman and a Christian and loved the Lord. One day, David came into my office, and he said, Brother June, he says, last night while I was praying, God told me that I can't get married. I'm not supposed to get married. And my first thought was, you're nuts. I mean, she was just a gorgeous girl. I'd have married her if I wasn't married already. She was really good looking. And I looked at him and I said, David, are you sure? He said, I'm positive. He says, I'm positive. God spoke to me and said I'm not supposed to get married. I said, well, if that's the facts, then you need to go talk to Kathy and you need to break it off now. Give her freedom, you know, so she can go find another fella. And they did, and they cried. And it was a hard thing because they loved each other. I mean, they were just like two peas in a pod. Of course, I don't know why we say that. That's not very good looking, but anyway. So he broke it off. Well, it wasn't, I don't know how many months after that. It wasn't very long. We sent David and Roland Harvey, who worked for me, and his fiancée, Kim, who's now his wife, over to Rush State Hospital on Highway 21 from Nacogdoches in my brand new car, 1976 Sportabout, to take some supplies, you know, toiletries and things like that, to a fellow we were working with, whose name was Bob. And on the way back on Highway 21, as they rounded a corner, they hit a truck head on. Roland got his ear cut off, which they sewed it back on. He was fine. Kim was over in the passenger seat, and she didn't even get a scratch. David Bryan was in the back seat, and he got thrown out the back of the car. I got a phone call. They said, you got to hurry. David's at the emergency room. We were in a wreck and totaled the car and totaled the truck. And I went down there, and David was moaning so loud, and just, he had the whole place disrupted. I mean, they couldn't talk to him or anything. He was dying. There was nothing they could do for him. He was so busted up on the inside. And I remember I walked in there, and it just is groaning, oh, like that. And the doctor said, we don't know what to do. We can't get him to quit. He's got all the patients upset and everything. I said, let me go pray with him. And so I go in there, and I started praying, and as soon as I started praying, he quit moaning. Just quiet, calm as he could be. I mean, facial expression changed. He couldn't understand what I was saying. He couldn't hear me. That, as far as we could tell, he couldn't communicate. And I mean, part of it because his brain was injured. Everything was busted up. And anyway, they took him that night to Tyler to try to save his life, and he died that night. And I thought, now I know why God didn't want him to get married. I thought he was nuts. But God pulled back the curtain and let me see the truth. If David had married, he would have died and left a widow, and possibly a little baby on the way that would have had to grow up without daddy. But because he listened to God, he didn't leave all those loose ends. And I thought, more of us need to listen to God. David did. And I was amazed. And, you know, God brought that all back to me while I was thinking about this thing. And David was right. He was right because God had spoken to him. And I've often thought, you know, most people I run into that even call themselves Christian, they don't want to hear from God because they're afraid God's going to tell them something they don't like. And they're not going to do it. I say, therefore, unto the unmarried and the widows, it's good for them if they abide even as I. If you're single, stay single. But if you cannot contain, that means control yourself, then go ahead and marry. It's better to marry than to burn. That word burn there means passion. It's not about going to hell. It's about having this desire, a deep desire to be like me. I cannot be single. Nancy knows that. I've told her for 45 years, honey, if you ever think you're going to die, then you got to give me 2 weeks notice and have a replacement trained. Because I'm not training another one. I'm glad she's out of the room. She'll say, you didn't train me, bud. I'll show you. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14, Paul talks about the young widows. He says they need to get married. Because if they're not married, they're going to run around being busybodies, getting in everybody else's business. And you know, I've seen a whole flock of women that were unmarried because they lost a husband, and that's what they were. They just ran around being busybodies, getting in everybody's business. They needed a husband. Now, I'm trying to leave my wife enough money so if I die first, she can buy her a husband. I said, honey, you need to buy you a retired doctor, maybe a widower. She said, why? I said, because at your age, you're going to need a doctor. Folks, this is God's word. If you do what God says in your relationships will last. Martin and Mary have been married a little longer than us. They're not perfect. Don't think they are, especially Martin, but that's another story. But they do try to do it God's way. Nancy and I have been married for 45 years because we try to do it God's way. Now, both of us were married before, and those marriages didn't last very long because we didn't try to do it God's way. We tried to do it ourselves. And what we do made a mess. You either do it God's way or you're not going to succeed. You're going to be miserable. Now, let me tell you a secret. When I met Nancy, I was not looking for a wife. In fact, I was raising my little boy because my first wife ran off and left me with the little boy, and I was raising him, and I didn't want to lose my little boy. That was my thing. It's my boy. And I had decided at that point in my life that I would just stay single the rest of my life and concentrate on raising my son. And that's when God brought Nancy across my path. I had never seen her before in my life. And I'm sitting there eating peanuts, throwing the shells into the grass. I was out of the hippie movement, and we did strange things. And she walked by at SFA in Nacogdoches, and she said, "Did you know those were biodegradable?" I looked up and I thought, I better find out what that means. Now, the fact that she had on a halter top and hot pants had little to do with it. But God spoke to me right there and said, that's the woman you're going to marry. So I followed her home, which today would be stalking. I'd be in jail probably. Followed her home, and I knocked on the door, and she came to the door and said, hello, will you marry me? And she almost fell down laughing. She said that was the funniest come on she'd ever heard in her life. I didn't even tell her my name. And anyway, I got to talking to her, found out she wasn't a Christian. I said, God, I can't marry this woman. She's not a Christian. And all the Lord would say is, that's the woman you're going to marry. So for 3 days, I talked to her about Jesus. We never had a date. I took her to church. And we knew each other about 12 days when we got married. Because she got saved on Wednesday, and then after that, about 4 days later, God spoke to her. And you know, I've often thought, after 40 years of ministry, if Nancy was to die, how could I replace her? And so I had to go through the files of 4 billion women, and I found out there's not another one. There's not another Nancy anywhere in the world. Number one, to put up with me, and then having to work. She works 7 days a week. I can't get her to slow down. She's 76 years old. I can't get her to slow down. Except I can outwalk her. Barely. How would I replace her? Can't. Can't be done. So obviously, she was the right woman for me. Perfect. Martin's got the perfect woman for him. Because if he gets out of line, Mary will straighten him out. Father, we thank you for loving us, and I do thank you for each one in the room. I hope they're listening. We still have a couple more weeks of discussion in this area, but the basics are there. To know that sex is not the problem inside a marriage, unless the two partners aren't willing to die to self and be obedient to God. And sometimes it's really hard. Some men are really demanding, and they don't consider their wives at all. And some women, I found, are very demanding and don't care about the needs of their husband. And usually those relationships don't last. I hope that maybe some of these folks in here will think back on some of the disasters that have been in their life in the area of relationships, and maybe make a vow to do it your way next time, to let you take care of things. We thank you for our Lord Jesus. We're so grateful that he paid the penalty for our sin and rose from the dead. And we're grateful that he's promised to return, and we know he will, and soon. Bless your word, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.